Well, thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation, for being here, Susan, and Andrea, and Rachel, and the team. We've been talking about me coming to show the film for a couple of years, and then the pandemic got in the way. And we thought about doing it online, but we just didn't think it would be the same. So it's great to finally be here, and I hope you enjoyed the film. I've found it fascinating being here, listening to some of the conversations from yesterday and earlier today. I've learned a lot of insights from all you folks here who are working in the jewelry sector. I'm an academic by background and a filmmaker, and I think we're really all concerned with the same kinds of problems and challenges. But maybe we look at them from a slightly different lens. But I think we all share the sort of vision of positive social change as well. Just to give you a little bit of background on how I approach the work, I'm based at the Centre for Development Studies at the University of Bath in the UK. I'm a human geographer by discipline, so geographers are interested in spatial relationships. And so, looking at things like supply chains is of interest to me, and looking at different scales and how different patterns and processes at different scales impact upon each other, and how that has bearing at what happens at the local level. I've been going to Sierra Leone for many years. I first started working in Sierra Leone in 2003, which was just after the war ended in 2002. And initially, I was there to look at post-conflict reconstruction. So I ended up in Kano district, which is one of the main diamondiferous areas in the country. And this was an area that was completely destroyed during the war. It was where some of the bitterest battles were fought. And when I first arrived there wasn't even a place for me to stay. I ended up staying with the UN peacekeeping force in a tent. But very quickly, as I spent time there, I spent 3 months there for my first visit. I was really interested, and there was still artisanal diamond mining going on after the war. It was one of the few things that people could do. There was no food. People had basically left during the war and were gone for a 10-year period. So all the farms were completely overgrown, but they were mining. And there was all this sort of talk about conflict diamonds, and this has come into the discussion over the last couple of days. Looked at conflict diamonds, conflict gold. But yeah, I was thinking, okay, there's all this wealth here. Surely there's a way for diamonds to be harnessed in a more positive way to help rebuild these communities. So that was my initial kind of introduction to artisanal diamond mining in Kano, and I really just kept working on it ever since then. So I've been going back. I go there 2 or 3 times every year. I was just there last July. I'm going again in December, and I've been revisiting the same community every time I go. I stay in the same house with the same people. They're all miners, so I've been really lucky. I think to get a bit of a sort of longitudinal picture, over the last 20 years of what's been going on there. And there's many things it's really depressing in many ways, because you can see the same problems just being perpetuated and continuing. But there's also been some small success stories. And one of the things I think it's really been nice for me being here with you all is that there is optimism. That things can change. And if we lose that optimism, then what have we got? So there's some big problems that need to be addressed, but there's also those small victories as well that are important for us to celebrate. I've been using film in my research for the last few years. I think film is a really powerful way of taking my academic work and translating it into something that I can share with a very wide audience. As an academic, I go and I do research and I write journal articles, and honestly, how many people are interested in reading my journal articles? Probably very few. And I don't blame you. They're for academics. But I feel I have this obligation to do more than that. I have to do it because I'm a professor at a university, but these are really important issues. I'm dealing with inequality, poverty, and the work has to be more than that. It has to do more than just inform journal articles. So I've been really concerned about the impact that the work has. So I've been working with with the Ministry of Mines in Sierra Leone to help inform recently a new artisanal mining policy that was released a couple of years ago. So that's been one thing I've done. But also film is something I think that people can, everyone has a mobile phone now, and you can click on a link, and the people that I work with in Kano can watch the film that we make together. So that's been quite an important part of the work. And as you've just seen from the film, what we were really trying to do is allow local voices really to come out in the film. So it's not just me, this white educated expert, going in and extracting information and deciding what needs to be done. It's really, really important for us to allow those local voices to come out. And arguably, any intervention or solution or policy change needs to be formed by these local realities. And we talked, I think yesterday we mentioned, one intervention can often lead to 3 or 4 new problems. We can fix one problem, but then there's other things that come up. And I would argue that, by spending more time engaging with those local voices and really listening before we do anything, that is an important part of the process. And so the film has really been an attempt to allow people, to talk about their own realities. As you'll have seen from the film, there's a really important livelihoods focus on the film. So this is the sector, the artisanal diamond mining sector, and gold mining now as well has really ramped up. But there's more than 300,000 people in Sierra Leone that are doing this kind of really rudimentary mining. And people are taking the money and using it in very productive ways. A lot of the time, they're sending their children to school, they're feeding their families, they're putting the money back into their farms. There's this really powerful and strong relationship between small-scale farming and artisanal mining in Sierra Leone. So during the rainy season, people will go and they'll farm and they'll grow rice. And then in the dry season, they'll go and do a bit of mining. And then there's this dovetailing of these two economies. And I think the narrative often suggests that people who mine are destructive to the environment and they destroy farmlands, and they shouldn't be doing this. But in this situation, we see that there's this really almost a symbiotic relationship. It allows people to straddle different activities at different times of year, and that's one of the, I think, the really, that if we can talk about an informal system, the benefits of informality, this is it. But there's at the same time, I think there's this massive push towards formalization. We've talked about this for the last couple of days. And what I've tried to do in the film is we've shown that there are massive challenges with formalizing. I myself have been quite a strong supporter of that, and I think formalization is a foundation for building a better system in terms of all of the interest in ethical sourcing and all of you. We can't really do that unless we have some kind of formal structures in place. It becomes really difficult to do that otherwise. So formalization, I think, is important, but it is challenging. There are all these vested interests locally that are benefiting very well from informality. So there's been in some ways a big resistance to that. But yeah, I mean, I guess the question I have for all of you is, if you think formalization is a foundation for building upon, what does a formalized system in somewhere like Sierra Leone look like? For policymakers, formalization is all about legality, and it's about licensing miners. But as you've seen from the film, there's so many other issues that we need to think about. A formalized system has to think about land issues. It has to think about finance. It has to think about access to, gender issues. It has to think about, there's a whole host of other things, I think, that are really important. So formalization can almost become like a package, I think. And is formalization, if you think it is the way forward, what would it look like, and what kind of incentives are needed to get everyone to buy into it? As you've seen, that not everyone is, fully in support of it. So these, I guess, are a couple of the bigger questions that I think would come out of the film. I'm really grateful and lucky to have Faz and Martin to provide a bit of a commentary maybe on what you've just watched as well. You both have lots of experience. Martin's been, as you heard, he's been researching diamonds for 50 years. All the books you told us about, you've read them all, I'm sure, so you know loads. And Faz has been doing some really important work in Sierra Leone. He's an academic, but he's also a social entrepreneur who's doing fantastic stuff with Root. And I'm hoping that you can tell us about that and how you're negotiating this really difficult terrain to try and make things better for Sierra Leoneans and seeing the benefits actually accrue to those local populations. So can we turn over and let them have a
Yeah, absolutely. What we're going to do next is have Faz come up and do a quick presentation. He's got some slides that we're going to show, and then after that we'll bring the whole panel to the stage and you can all Q&A away.
That's good.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
All right, let's get it going.
So we're looking for slides.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was just, so anyways, so my name is Lebbie. I actually have one of my heroes here, Christina. I am a big fan of your work. So would I just tell you next?
Yep, just say next slide.
So I am pleasantly surprised to see you here. So we have conversations with you. But I am currently a PhD student at CMU, Carnegie Mellon University. I'm doing my PhD in transition design. So today, I think I wanted to just bring us into this idea of modeling sustainability and equity. And again, I think there's going to be a dance between the way academia is impacting the real world and that friction between that and seeing what we might surface and what would that look like. Next slide. So briefly about me, like I said, I did my master's at Parsons School of Design, strategic design, University of Utah. Then my only book that is Souvenirs of My Awakening, and my first initiative was the FAST project, which actually focused on working with underprivileged children in Sierra Leone, and in terms of providing educational needs, and then currently I'm a design manager at Meta, so I manage a design team in the building enterprise software, and then work with MIT Gov right now in terms of governance innovation in Africa. So next. That gives a little bit of background. So I think in building onto what Roy said, I want to bring us here because what we see here is someone who has my lived experiences. So I came here to the diversity lottery from Sierra Leone. And when I went back, this is a friend back when I was younger, when I went back and doing my research. This was fascinating to go back after 17 years, and I saw a difference in the contrast in our lifestyle. And I know a lot can be said about the opportunities in America and American exceptionalism, so that's it for another story. But for right now, we see an analogous example of the opportunities and going back and seeing him being relegated and entrapped in a system of exploitation that is much more complex. By his own, no amount of self-will and determinations can actually uproot him because of the complexities of the systems. Next. You guys will be patient with the next, so we will get there. So I think today what I wanted to talk briefly is about where we were within the extractive sector, where we are, and then where we're going. So next, where we are, and then where we're going. Next. So where we are, next. So I think this idea of roughness and density of exploitation has been something very real in the industry as I've gone through this. So this idea of sacrifice zones and sacrifice bodies becomes a reality in the industry as sacrifice zones are really these places who don't count. places that don't count, that are relegated in the environmental conditions and the challenges that are happening. And then we see this idea of sacrifice bodies, which, if the reality is to some level, when they have a reflective piece there, I might have been there at sacrifice bodies with my friend because there was not anything special about me, right, to be here. So there's this real sense of what it means about sacrifice bodies within the extractive sector and sacrifice zones. Next. And then, so that gives a little bit of, so where we are, keep looking next. So where we are. So I think what's interesting here is this idea of visibility, right? When we see what's happening with the miners currently in landowners, and when we see this, this notion of transnational mega corporations and what actually is happening in terms of ownership and the rights to the minerals, and there's a lot of complexity here, but I think in understanding our space, there's a talk of what we need to begin to understand what is legal and what is ethical. And I think that's a quintessential characteristic of beginning to have a conversation, right? Because I think a lot of times right now we are in the space of most companies are doing what's legal and they're going by the rules, but I think have we outgrown that, right? What is the next conversation about being ethical? And I think those are sort of the interactions within our space right now and the engagement. Next. And then this leads me to kind of my work where can there be ethical, equitable capitalism under the current systems of extraction, right? And this is really what we are trying to figure out, right? Many advocates, activists, companies are bringing different facets to this, right? To begin to enter into conversations. Next. So where are we going? This kind of puts me into where my work comes in. And this is actually one of Cody and Christina's work, actually. So as you can see, I think what I wanted to use with Christina's work is to anchor me in terms of the next step. So when you look at the current discourses, right, from 1970s, 80s, and the choreography of the conversations, how it's evolved. I think we are right now in this notion of sustainable livelihoods, right? It's evolved to that. So how do we then transition to we have fair mind, fair trade, we have all these necessary steps that have been taken, but how do we actually begin to think beyond that conversation of that? What does the transition look like for sustainable model? So next. And so our model, next. So this idea of local diamonds conceived, owned, and operationalized by artisanal miners and landowners for local and global markets. So this is really what we are trying to do next, and I'll zoom into that. So Wood Studios, so here's how it works. The center of gravity for our work is not the supply chain. It is actually what we do is we focus on Wood Studios as center of gravity where we target youth, women, and the disabled. So what do we do? So we actually create we focus on resource revenue for human capital development. So we focus on diamond cutting initiatives, jewelry design, product design, entrepreneurship, mineral design, and some mentorship. So that is the center of gravity. How do we do it? How do we sustain that? That's when we begin to talk about supply chain and how we are able to give people access to some of the resources in the community and then be able to maintain that. So, because I think for me, when I go back in Sierra Leone, given being in a Kono tribe, where you were, when I go back, it's very interesting because the people are tired of solutioning that doesn't work. And the first realization is the African problems will never be solved by the West, right? So that is the orientation we need to understand. So when we see that, what's happening is the Wood Studios actually focus on human capital development that the people can see in real time, right now. And this is because if you go back to what I said, the roughness and density of exploitation. When that happens to someone, you stop. You just don't have a lot of imaginaries about the future anymore. So they need to see entrepreneurial notes of real world impact right now for them to begin to believe in what people are saying. And that's sort of what we're trying to do. So, like I said, we have a model that's called Story Diamonds. That's a supply chain facet. Next. And really what Wood Studio is, we leverage resource revenue for human capital development, focus on the things really the capacity building technical skills that the miners, the community can actually begin to see what these imaginaries of an actually post-extractive world look like, and how would that work for them in their own image, not in ours. Next. So briefly, this is just diamond cutting, which is where I'm lucky to have Mickey and Martin's guidance, lots of experience, and it's been amazing. It's been a blessing for me to be able to have them and embark in this journey, and the breadth and depth of experience they bring to this space. Next. Jewelry design, which we have we have a South African designer who's coming in to do this with us in Sierra Leone. So we'll start, so I know my audience is majority jurors, so there's opportunities for us to talk more about and help pave the path, because I think this is a space that is very little amount of knowledge capital for us. Next. Mineral design, this is regard to my PhD work, so I'll be engaging in improving local needs and place-based resources so they can understand what opportunities, also what else they can do with their resources. Next. And then this obviously is my space. I manage a team at Meta, and I've been product design. So this is something I'll be bringing in to allow them to actually have opportunity in the global space after graduating with the programs that I'm giving, so that it can actually become, but the key thing is that they need to see that natural resource revenue is producing this, not the other way. That's the transition model. That's where we're going next. And obviously entrepreneurship. And then next, and I'll close out, let's say, so precedent case. So this is my great-great-grandfather. So this is interesting because as I was doing research, this notion of human capital development actually has worked in the NDMC, I'm sure. They actually invested in people, locals, to go out. This is him going to England to study engineering through the Diamond Initiative. So what this tells us is that it has worked, right? There's a precedent that companies in the early 50s, 40s actually went when diamond was actually found in Sierra Leone. And so this was an interesting story for me to understand the choreography of my work and the importance of it. Next. So market-facing responses, really, I'll just take you through what Wood Diamond and Wood Studios is. Next. So basically, we established a co-op, and it's very small scale right now. Obviously, in initiatives like this, small scale is a blessing because so you can be able to actually implement it. So we source our diamonds from our artisanal miners. Next. And basically, what it is this idea of experience-heavy material light. What does that mean in our industry? And it means that this landowner, jewelry designer, consumer, there's a connection about what experiences that elicit with diamonds and how do we bring those to life and reduce on the materiality of it, right? And so transition that. Next. And this is what our supply chain looks like, the landowner, car polish, and we're looking into engagement rings in telling that story. Next. And like I said, right now we are origin plus value plus symbolism, story diamonds. So that's sort of like what we are featuring next. And then just to close, this is something Cheryl Doyle did in the future of fish. And this really begins to open up the space of what is happening and where we're at. So when you see the current system, what's happening right now, you see how from strangers and lengthy process between origin of a diamond, point of choice. And this begins to orient where our consumers are, right? And what they're thinking. And they want shorter links. Next. From opaque supply chains that can hide exploitation, they demand transparency and responsible actors. Next. From fragmented and fractured structures in the industry, they really demand traceable networks through technology. And then from fragmented and fractured, from letting big corporations have more control, they demand equitable supply, right? Next. And this is just kind of to close, this is what our experience looks like in our website, in terms of going in and understanding the story and making sure that that connects, and also understand what the actual landowner is wanting with the purchase, and how that feedback loop in terms of creating the revenue, so that those images of their futures are actually materialized through our model. Next. And in terms of, just to close, so this is sort of like my background in technology and things, thinking about the future of it and how do we begin to immerse the industry. So what does it look like for someone to be in America and actually enter the artisanal mining space? How do we materialize the video that Roy just said that someone can experience? So this is sort of like a future thing that we're working towards to bring to light a new facet in the industry. Next. And then to close, this is just a quick what future of sustainable mineral resource look like. Just sustainable resource extraction that protects life support systems at the core, at the foundation, and then transparency in the supply chains and the cost, the true cost. And earlier on, I forgot the name, they were talking about this idea of true cost and premium cost. And I think for us to begin to get comfortable with this idea of true cost is the pathway to sustainability. And I know there are many nuances, competition, capital in it, that makes that complex. But I think that's very essential. And then at the end, this idea of linkages, right? And so we're starting right there in the top right, and we make linkages, economic linkages, at the center of gravity of our work, and then the supply chain becomes a path for us to get revenue to maintain and have the good studios continue to operate. So I think that's pretty much, that's it in terms of our model right now.
That's amazing, because we've been talking for years about how to get a model together for doing this work in the countries. So it's exciting to see one actually fully developed.
Thank you all for being here and for what you've contributed, not just to us today, but what you've contributed to the world overall. I think I just want to start with my first experience actually hearing about Boz. I attended the Rappaport Diamond Conference, which I think many of you know is quite controversial. And it's always those voices that sort of stand up and say, this isn't okay anymore. We want to talk about other things that always resonate with me. And Martin stood up this year. Was this year?
For the last 3 or 4 years.
Okay, last 3 or 4 years. And said, I met this man, and he's extraordinary, and talked about Boz and this important work. And so immediately, a couple of years ago, I was like, oh my God, I have to meet this human being, and who is coming at this with such an interesting perspective. And here he is finally getting to speak to all of you who do care. And so I'm so glad that you finally have that voice, and Martin, thanks for bringing me here. So I guess I want to start with the movie for a moment. Because what I saw there was really an on-the-ground community sort of issue. And we all sit in this room and say, well, how can we create the supply chain and make things better? But clearly there are things happening within their own community that need to be worked out before that moves forward. So when you hear all these things, what do the villagers, what do people talk about there? What do they see as solutions and change that can be almost made immediately?
Yeah, no, it's a really good. I think it's a really good point. It's really complex, and I think we tend to talk about miners at the bottom of the chain, and we sort of homogenize this group of miners, but it's such a diverse group of people with different interests, different agendas. You saw that there's the digger, but then there's the supporter, there's the eye of the supporter, there's the dealer, there's the broker, there's the exporter, there's all of these other people who are deriving a livelihood out of artisanal mining. It's not just the person digging it out and the person supporting. So, I mean, this is one of the big challenges, I think, is trying to reconcile this complexity between all these different actors. And we talk about formalizing the sector or shortening the supply chain, but I mean, what happens to all these other people who are dependent on the sector? So, and there's been various attempts to try and bring some money back to the communities of origin and let them use money for development in a positive way. There's the Diamond Ifris Area Community Development Fund, the DACEF, which I think you saw was mentioned in the film. It's a 3% export tax on diamonds and 0.75%, a very small amount, goes back to the chiefdom of origin. There's a CDC, a Community Development Committee, that makes decisions on how that money is spent. But we see the same old problems, playing out again. There are more powerful voices and there are marginalized voices within communities. So we can put all the proper stakeholders into the CDC. We can make sure that there's representation of women and youth and all the different people. But often it's one voice that's actually making the decision for what's happening with the money and how it's being used or mismanaged in many cases. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, so Faz, you're on the ground, you've lived it. These are friends and colleagues of yours. And clearly there is a structure that is in place already that kind of needs to almost be broken down. We talked a bit about that it must be local, it must be on the ground, sort of governmental, maybe self-regulation, I'm not sure. But what, how can what you're doing help sort of fix it, not fix, but sort of rearrange the structure so that everyone benefits?
Sorry. I'm thinking, I guess first, artisanal mine, most of them is a poverty-driven thing that they are, the infrastructural terrain of the system forces them to actually go and do that. And what's interesting is that when you look at what's happening in the ground, it's actually one of the few ways, or probably the only way, they actually benefit. Even in that sort of entrapment state, it's still better because the money actually doesn't come down. So what you see for us, what we're trying to do is, this idea of scale is maybe need to be redefined as small and local, and sort of like small villages that are actually a multiplicity of unlikes in a way. And I think that's what we are trying to do, is that we are trying to allow artisanal miners to have a voice in the space, but not just that. Where actually there's a whole other thing, the choreography of a diamond, when you think of it. It actually ends up to the consumer in the West, right? So there's an interesting space where the consumer begins to be an activism directly with the miner without going through the middle. So there is so as jurors, consumers, there's an opportunity also to influence the market conditions in a way. And I think when you begin to add that, when you begin to think about how we do that at an individual level, or that at a neighborhood level, in region, and all the way out, I think those are the layers and sort of like an ecologies of intervention that begins to change the dynamics because of how complex it is. So I think for us, we are trying to start with the consumer and the miner, and then we have an actual tangible, visceral proof of what a mineral what sustainable minerals can do in the community, and we hope that those levels of interventions can begin to surface or kick off the dust for other advocates to jump in.
How important, this is for both of you, how important is time? Because we don't wait. We're not good at waiting. We want change to happen right away. And clearly this is a process that, between your filming and, what are you going to see next year? You said you go back, and your work. What are we looking at in terms of how much time that we need to sort of be patient and wait and support till this can sort of grow?
Yeah, I mean, the diamonds are a finite resource, and since they were first discovered in the 1930s, I love seeing the photograph of your grandfather Tasaluku in the 1940s. Is he part of the Tasaluku family? So
Yeah.
So he's the paramount chief of Sandra chiefdom now, yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Royalty here.
Yeah, I think so. Anyway, yeah, I mean, it's, these surface deposits have been worked out, over the years, and it's becoming a lot more difficult now to find, good stone. So, back in the day when that photograph that we saw, I'd heard stories about, people talking about their grandfathers and how, all of his houses came from diamonds, and, after a rainy day you could find a diamond on the ground, and, there were plenty of diamonds in those days, but it's becoming more challenging now, I think. And I was just in Kano district in July, and, finally people are talking about moving away from the sector. So agriculture has always been something there, and people are now talking about, not just producing rice for home consumption, but thinking about forming associations where higher value crops can be grown, for export. So there's some really interesting, because there's, in many ways there was such resistance to becoming a farmer for so long, but now people are talking about it as a commercial activity that potentially could, carry over after, in a post-extractive society, which I found fascinating. It's really the first time I've heard it.
So how does that play into what you're doing? I mean, I think that you must have to consider that, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly what our model is, right? With downstream economic linkages, right? What is that? How do we transition people? Those who want to do it can do it, but how do we transition the community in terms of at the precipice of resource exhaustibility, right? What does that look like? Well, it looks like more a diverse range of activities like product design, like mineral design, like all these different things that entrepreneurship, right? How does the mining, the industry begin to invest in those? Because some of these countries, as much as are running out, and there is a real risk of that, and that's what our model actually begins to tackle first, is transition model. Then in sustaining that, we use the right reasons why resources were in the first place put in these places to build the infrastructure to sustain that, and that's exactly what our model is trying to do.
And can I just add, I love your philosophy of sort of, the solutions will only come from within. It's not about someone like me going to a community and making suggestions about what has to happen, but it has to be driven from the ground up. And I also love the fact that you're working with Martin to add value to these resources. This is something, historically, in so many resource-rich countries in Africa, they've been told to exploit their comparative advantage, which is, exporting raw materials and letting someone else profit and add value. And what you guys are doing, I really want to hear more about this, about the cutting, and this is really important, I think.
Can you tell us how you met and?
Yeah, I can, before I say anything, I absolutely have to thank Susan for this conference, and not just this conference, but the last 5 or 6 that we've had. And the opportunity to be here, it's a transformative experience in and of itself. So I first came here to introduce a way to look at recycled diamonds, recut them, and add some margin to your business in an ethical way. And at that particular meeting, a woman came up to me and she said, recycled diamonds, we sell those, but we really want to sell artisanally mined diamonds, because that way you can actually affect change in the diamond, in the mining community. And so I kind of had to go back to the wheel. I'm an academic as well. My father was a professor of mining, and my master's is actually in human geography as well, in minerals and development in Southern Africa. So I started paying more attention to how can I help that source? And the focus on artisanal mining is to get more revenue to the artisanal miner. And you can see that the whole structure of that business is built on a colonial model. and it's very oppressive to those who are digging out of the ground. There's no question about it, to the point where, to Foz's point, they're stuck. So Foz's model is one of the most far-reaching, you know, integrative models that I've heard, and he reached out, and this is what I said at Rappaport conference, you know, the thing was, we keep trying to do all these things in Sierra Leone and nothing works, they keep staying poor. Should we just put them in a U-Haul van and take them where the jobs are, or what, you know? And I said, well, you think you've helped, but you haven't helped because you haven't asked them what they want. And let me tell you a story. I've been wanting to do this personally. My thesis was 25, 30 years ago was to bring diamond cutting to Botswana. And you know, because you need value added from your mineral resource, whatever resource, in order to develop your economy. That's what it's about. Okay, so, and I thought diamond cutting is perfect. Mickey and I, we're all three partners in this venture. Mickey and I both started at the wheel, and I went upstream all the way up into, from the wheel to the final consumer. Mickey went downstream, spent his last half of the last 50 years in Sierra Leone. So when Foz came to us, or to me, and asked me about this venture in Sierra Leone, I said, well, if it's in Sierra Leone, one thing, and the other thing is Mickey, you know. So we brought this team together, and we realized that where at first it was kind of a mining and selling from the mine, selling to the consumer in the United States, and having a structure so where 40% of that profit could go back to the company, 40 back to the community, and 20 back to the actual miner. We know the miner of every single stone. So that was the original model. And over the last couple of years, from hearing things and from learning, we found that, you know, probably the most instructive thing to do would be to help human development in that area. Because as was said yesterday, mining by its very nature is not a sustainable business. It runs out. So what's left? A hole in the ground and a decimated economy, and what Matthew was talking about, a total wasteland. Okay, that's what's left. Unless you can use that mining to develop. So for us, my feeling is the first major transformation that takes place in a diamond is when it gets cut and turned from raw material into something beautiful and something desirable that people want for any number of reasons. Once you've learned how to cut, it's what I call, and Mickey and I, we are what I call artisanal cutters. We learned old school. Give us a diamond, we can make anything, any shape, any way we want. Most diamond cutting work in the world today is factory work. It's sectional, they're knocking out round brilliant triple X's, that's what they're doing. And such that they try and bring diamond cutting to Africa, they do that to get source, full well knowing that they're gonna bail out because they can't compete with the Indians. So our idea is bring diamond cutting to the local community at the local level, let them be involved in building that incubator to teach diamond cutting, to artisanal diamond cutting, because they can't, a factory can't source from those mines. It's not productive enough. To teach that, to give them entrepreneurial skills, to teach the youth, empower the youth, to use the resource to build their local economy. Give them a structure that's different than what they've been used to perennially. And those changes take place literally, as we've been saying, one step at a time.
I want to ask a question that, sorry, I didn't ask you guys when we spoke earlier, but it just came to me now. You know, back when the whole issue of blood diamonds came about, the large-scale industry thought of it as a huge public relations problem. And Sierra Leone was often mentioned as a part of, if not the main issue, and be afraid, etc. And so I'm curious to know, you guys are on the ground, you're seeing things as they are, and how much of a public relations nightmare have we caused as a result, and has that damaged the ability of those on the ground to make a bigger, a better Sierra Leone?
I mean, I think so, yeah. I teach some master's level courses at the University of Bath, and I talk about my work on artisanal mining a lot, and when my students find out about what I do, they go, oh, yeah, I saw that film with Leonardo DiCaprio, and that's what the country is, that's the thing that stands out. I mean, it's about the conflict in the diamonds, and there are so many other issues, I think. I think the whole blood diamonds thing in some ways has been problematic because, obviously it was a real issue and it was important, not to belittle it at all, but there are all these other social issues. There's, issues to do with equity and inequality and working conditions and exploitation. All of these things are not covered by, this whole narrative. And that's what there's been so much done on blood diamonds, so my focus has been on livelihoods. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that has been, in some ways, a problem, in my opinion. Yeah.
We all have to be a part of the change of that narrative in a way based on what we're all hearing,
Well, to Foss's history and to what Roy is saying, blood diamonds created a public PR problem, but it was the way it was presented and the way it's been seen throughout the world and the trade and consumers and everything since. It's a blame the victim thing. It was Sierra Leone, and that was the problem. Was these, there was blood diamonds. No, it was created. It's a legacy of colonialism. De Beers left Sierra Leone before the conflicts. The reason they left is they were done. It was not good enough for them anymore. And what they left behind them was a shambles. And in that shambles, what little resource was left over became part of the mix. But it is a colonial legacy. It is not a product of the diamonds themselves. It's not a product of the people of Sierra Leone. It is a product of the system. And so it's a systemic change that has to happen. And the only systemic changes you can make are from the ground up. They don't happen from the top down because the top, as you saw in the film, and as you know in the world, the top is who controls things. They're not going to change it. They'll play PR to it. They'll greenwash it. They'll do whatever they have to maintain that position, but they're not giving it up. So it takes baby steps.
Yeah, I think in terms of the war itself, there's been a lot of debate over whether the war was, about diamonds or fueled by diamonds. I mean, diamonds are certainly implicated, but there's this whole sort of greed versus grievance debate where some people argue that, it was just a cover, the warfare was just a cover so that people could gain access to diamonds and benefit. The other side of it, which I find more convincing, is that there was a whole generation of disenfranchised youth who had no opportunities, that basically there was quite a brutal dictator in power through the 1980s, Shaka Stevens, who hollowed out the state, benefited incredibly from all the resource wealth. And you had this group of angry youth who, there's massive inequality, there was no job opportunities, they couldn't get education. And this was the fomenting conditions for the war. This is what, it was like throwing a match into, and it just blew up. And by not addressing some of the same problems of inequality in these diamond-first communities, we're in some ways reliving the same situation if people aren't benefiting and they're not getting a fair share. I mean, it's dangerous, I think, and I think, we have to, I'm not trying to, this whole security issue, I think is, it's problematic in many ways, this narrative, but I can see that, unless we create a more equal and fair system, that really is quite high in my perspective, my agenda about it.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, because I think my work I look at it at a more African decolonial lens, in terms of the extractive industry, and you start seeing, and right at that, you see governance challenge, right? That is embedded in all aspects of it in terms of how does the individual miner or landowner have actually benefit from it. and how do we actually manage these resources in terms of people in positions of power. So you begin to see, in some ways, fractional exploitative structures, where in many sense, most of the big, and I was telling Brandee about it, the big organizations never have to go to a mine, or ever, and they just get parcels, right? And so when we talk about it, there's no lived experience about that, right? And the reason why is because of the fractional exploitative systems that we, in some ways, when we think about a decolonial aspect of the extractive sector, is a governance challenge. It is also an African challenge for ourselves in terms of how we have co-opted our own failure in terms of in the rest of the world. And I think when we begin to think about all of those layers and the disenfranchisement of the youths, what was happening with Shaka Stephen, and you see it now where the NMA actually, when it generates revenue, actually decides where the money goes, right? It's like, no, like the financial side, the financial department does that, right? Because there's a department for that. So you begin to see a lot of this structures that make a lot of people angry, and obviously corporations can take advantage of the civil war. But the civil war is what got me here with my family winning the lottery to come to America. So it's embedded in our memories and our futures also in many sense. And I think that's a real thing that people need to sort of understand the implications of that and the current ongoing implications, but also the temporal implications of that too that's happening in real time. So, and that's why models in the industry needs to be holistic and needs to be intentional at different levels of scale, because it's not a one, even my solution is one, it's just one facet of it, right? And we have to begin to think about the different facets together.
You mentioned Leonardo DiCaprio, and so my mind is going a little wild over this, because I think about how the way he handled this, right, and got on top of this, basically led to the formation or the formalization of a lab-grown diamond industry, which directly takes away from the people on the ground and the work that you're doing. So it's mind-boggling how the West gets involved and we make shambles of everything. So anyway.
Yeah.
What time what timing do we have? Because I do know the audience probably has questions.
We're gonna open up that
Yeah.
What I'll do is I'll start with a question for the virtual audience, and then Rachel can grab a microphone so that she can run with that. Okay, go ahead. So, let me find this first question.
Make sure my mic is on. The first one from the virtual audience was, a couple of these are directly for Roy. I really appreciate learning how the mining supporter dealer system works in Kono. If one of the miners were here today, what do you think they would want jewelers to ask before we buy a diamond? And what would they want consumers to ask before buying one? That's from Christina Molly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all concerned here about the same question, is that, that artisanal diamond miners are not benefiting at all. So, and we've talked about the power and the importance of storytelling and knowing, tracing back that story and finding out not just the origin of the diamond, but, what are the conditions that this diamond was found in? Were you paid fairly? Questions, again, coming back to livelihoods, I think, are key. That's what I would think they'd want to know is, these are both questions from consumers and from jewelers, I think, that we should be asking and wanting to know more about, because I think there's just so many people who aren't even aware. I mean, there's these invisible stories that people aren't even aware of. We can celebrate the positive stories, but there's another darker side as well, I think.
Fair enough. Foz, do you have something to add to that? If you thought through a whole model, you've probably thought through the customer journey side. What questions do you want them to be asking?
I think probably just reframe it in terms of where understanding the structure of a diamond and where it comes from and who has the majority. So I think when we see a diamond, we see about 80% of it is actually large scale, big companies. So, and then about 20% is actually artisanal mining. So I think the challenge is that might be the first place to understand what has happened to the diamonds, but we do not have access to them. And it's very hard. That at the first begins to create the complexity of it, I think, because if I see a diamond and I know it's an artisanal mining, then it pushes us into an engagement that asks very tough questions. Even a large scale also has its challenges. But I think that probably begins first to answer that question.
I think too that buried inside those models you saw, there was what was happening in the incubator. And there's two things happening. One is that the end consumer in the model for root diamonds will have access to the miner that mined that particular diamond. So there's a feedback loop. But there's also, there was a word up there that said mentorship. And that mentorship can be from the consumer to the producer, where they can establish a relationship because they know who each other are now. And it can also be, we're looking right now, and I'll just make this pitch, Root Diamonds is looking for mentors in the jewelry business, in this room, who are willing to donate an hour or two of their time a year to just mentor somebody who has some questions. You know, I'm from Sierra Leone. I want to know, you know, I've got this idea, how does that fly? How does that work for you? What does that look like, you know? And so we're starting to do it. The backstory to everything that's going on here is an enormous amount of work. It's mind-boggling on its own.
I just want to add to in that mentorship. I think it's very important in terms of making sure those mentorships, those interactions are in their own image, not through a Western lens. And I think that's incredibly important in how that is communicated in this homogenization of knowledge, that the West is a default of rightness. So I think we want to be able to surface that too as we open this sort of space. And then that's something we're very intentionally aware of, especially within the mentorship.
Thank you very much. My name is Pauline. Yes, I am from Zambia. You know, in Zambia we don't have diamonds, but then there's something that I want to find out. Why the diamonds from ASM, like from Angola, are actually labeled as black diamonds. What makes them to be black? So there's that stigma.
It is a stigma, and it's a stigma imposed. In a lot of ways, I mean, a lot of the history that our consumers are aware of today and feel very knowledgeable about is De Beers is a monopoly, blood diamonds are a problem. These are a generation old already, okay? De Beers hasn't been a monopoly for 20 years. They're part of an oligopoly, okay, but, and the blood diamond, the conflicts have stopped. And Angola was all the frontline states around South Africa were extreme conflict zones up until Nelson Mandela walked out of jail, so, which was 20 years ago. So, almost 30 years ago, I think. So, a lot of people who feel informed are informed on very old news. There's a lot of things that have happened in the meantime. And unfortunately, those things stick, and they are stigma. I mean, that's essentially what's going on. What's nice about these small models is if you can build a success in one area, do it in, I mean, Moino Gems and Virtue Gem have been total eye-openers to me that this is exactly what we've been trying to throw together before. And so they have success stories. This is now a thing that we can build on, and we can start to change that narrative.
I just want to add two things, just one quick thing to that, actually. I've known for a while, we basically developed as an industry or as a global community the Kimberley process. And what major companies in retail did was use the Kimberley process as their checkmark in their training of their thousands upon thousands of employees. And said when a consumer walks in and says, do you have blood diamonds? You tell them that we are part of the Kimberley process and we know where our diamonds, and so this narrative has been fed to thousands upon thousands of people who are answering the questions when a customer walks into a retail store and says, I want an engagement ring, I want a diamond, I want to represent love. And that person has been trained to say, well, we don't have any blood diamonds. We're perpetuating this instead of changing the narrative to talk about all of the good things. And I think to what Martin has said over and over again, we need to be the ones to change it, because that's where it comes from.
We have another question from the virtual audience. Abigail Sibando, who's with the Merengue Women's Alliance, wants to ask Dr. Maconachie, were there any women minors in the research? What gender inequalities emerged from your research? And what role did the local women play?
It's a great question, and it's one I've had many times before, because I think that's something that's very noticeable in the artisanal diamond mining sector. In Sierra Leone, it's very male-dominated. There are women involved, but generally it's groups of young men. You do find some women doing washing and things like that. If we had a conversation about the artisanal gold mining sector, it would be a completely different story, because that is predominantly women who are doing the mining. And this, I think this goes back a long way. You know, you talked about, you know, the mining that was going on in the 1930s, and it was very much about young men, you know, engaging in sort of casino capitalism, trying to, with the hope that they were going to one day find this big diamond. And they weren't even interested in the gold, you know, back in the 40s and 50s, whatever. And all of the tailings that, you know, in the MC now are being overkicked right now. They're going through it and extracting the gold. And it's always been there, they just weren't interested in it. And so alongside these groups of men, who are young men, who are, you know, doing diamond mining, very quietly on the side, you see women extracting, you know, small amounts of gold every day, taking that away, putting it into businesses, using it for so many productive activities. And I think this is, you know, there's much more interest in gold now in Sierra Leone, particularly with, you know, the prices and stuff over the last decade. But it's very interesting how there is that division, that gender division, I think, between the two different resources, really, gold and diamonds.
What drives that? Just men having access to the higher value resource, or is there some other infrastructure that causes it?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's, you know, it's always been about, you know, you'll see a young diamond miner who's struck it rich, and they'll, you know, found a big diamond, and they'll go off and they'll buy themselves a motorcycle, and they'll come back wearing all kinds of clothes, you know, new clothes and stuff. And I don't know. I mean, you might have a better idea about why it's been. You may disagree with me. I mean, there are women involved in the diamond mining sector, but it's certainly, in my experience, I would say, it's been mainly young men doing it.
Yeah, I think I agree. In Sierra Leone specifically, it's very patriarchal sort of like orientation, and most of Africa. And I think what we see is most of the time, most of the women also, the life expectancy is very low. A lot of their husbands have passed away, so you see women in there working with their kids. And sometimes what's interesting, when you see sort of like this manifestation of nature in some ways, where many times I've been there and I saw an artisanal miner as a woman, I actually see a kid around. And it's very interesting to see that orientation of protection, even in that entrapment. But I think in terms of the rate, there's higher men that are in there because of this possibility and stories of success to provide. But we see a lot of actually exploitation that's happening between the men and women, actually. So this is where it gets complex. You begin to see the fractional exploitation, where you're talking about how to be better and do something for the artisanal mining. But when you zoom in closer, you also see a new form of exploitation of women being exploited by the artisanal miners also. And you begin to see the complexity of it, because they either they need income, they don't have ownership to land, you begin to see, oh wow, there's another zoomed in lens here that makes this so complex. So I think there's many layers to it, but that's you begin to see those different facets as to. But yeah, overall, I agree. There's a minimum amount of the proportion is low, but the women and the children actually are the people that have, in terms of the weightiness of exploitation is felt more in their own experiences when you zoom in.
This whole concept that you're explaining, the different facets of being on the ground, and it's just so not lost on me that that's what a diamond is. And here we have all of these various angles that you look at it from.
It's when you think about it, it's just an object, right, on the ground that is apolitical, but there's so many experiences around it that are formed from people, and so many systems that are formed within that coherent environment.
Okay, you got a question over there, Rachel?
I'll be digesting what I've heard here for a while. Your slides alone are incredible. There's a lot happening here. But in terms of the social and the human development side, in Sierra Leone, I know from experience how challenging it can be to actually implement that. And so can you tell us a little bit more about what local partners have to be in place, what the structure is like, and how is it going?
All right, I guess that's one for me. The assumptions here. I think in terms of the local partnerships, there are, and I think that's what I also realize is that we're talking with the people there are solutions. The things that we're talking have actually been pitched, and there are partners who actually are doing that. I think for me, when we think about solutions and partnerships, I think for me, the lens that I take is it's not the solutions that are brought, it's the infrastructure. What does it repress and tolerate? What does it stimulate? And I think until we begin to think about this, the partners, and to answer your question, there are many partners that are actually trying to do good, and there are a few that, but I think to address that in terms of actually making progress, this is where sadly it goes right to the heart of governance. Challenges that actually begins to stimulate or represses these ideas. But this notion of me going back and presenting ideas is always cringy in my very Western education at Carnegie Mellon, and going back and so I have to check that in some ways as I go about it. But I do think that it's the solutions are there in terms of partnership. We need more activism in terms of jurors, in terms of forcing organizations that then in turn change behavior, that then allow the good politicians to actually do their work. And I think when you think of all of that, that's when you start seeing partnership work making real progress. But I don't want to just be down. There are real progress that have been made on advocates that are doing real work, and I think part of that is how they're able to work on a sort of entrepreneurial basis in very local capacity with the people one-on-one, and you see a lot more progress there. But when you zoom out, it begins to be very challenging.
Another question from you're going to keep answering that?
I just was thinking while you're talking about it, just one other area I think that could possibly, I think it's fantastic that the cutting is, you guys are moving towards doing that locally and creating value in Sierra Leone. But another area, in my opinion, that needs work still is just helping people with the knowledge for assessing how much a stone is worth.
Well, that's part of the cutting curriculum.
Okay. I mean, you saw in the film Mohammed Jabi, who was one of the founders of Maconachie, the movement for concerned Kano youth. So Martin Rappaport sent him to Dubai, I think, and they trained him on how to value diamonds. And I know locally, he has shared that knowledge and he's helped people, but there's still a long way off, I think. That's just actually knowing what you got, I think, is before we get to the cutting and polishing, is really important, so that's good to know you're doing that.
Well, right, the whole concept, you know, the diamond cutting piece, basically, like Mickey and I as an example, you know, you learn how to cut. All of a sudden, that opens up. You have to know what the internal structure of the diamond is. You have to know what its value is. You know, because you want to make the biggest, prettiest, most valuable thing you can out of it. So that's all part of the training to do that. And then once somebody has learned that, they've got a transformative skill, and now they realize they're an agent of change somehow, whether they know the terminology, and then their personality is going to take them, either they'll stay at the wheel for the rest of life, or they'll go upstream in the marketing and design and things like that, or they'll go downstream and help buy better and help, you know, and that's the portion where the locals take control of that knowledge and use it in the ways that they see fit and that suit their personality. So that became a very important key to the process. It's not so much dumping money, it's adding skill levels and adding value added. Yeah.
I think some of the programs that we've spoken about regarding colored stones, some of these smaller but amazing programs are doing those things successfully. And you can see that just the added value and how that changes the confidence level and the ability to be able to go out there with so much of a stronger pitch for making this happen even more and more. So I think we've got a lot to learn from one another within diamonds and gemstones in this way.
Another question from the virtual audience, and again for Dr. Maconachie. Is it possible for your film to be shown in educational settings, particularly in like, gemologist and jeweler training?
Yeah, I would love people to use the film for whatever way they can. If it's about advocacy and about sharing the local knowledge. So it's you've got the full film now. So if you can make that available on your
Thank you. That's amazing. That's really good deal. Thank you.
I know that
All of our
collaborative
organizations should try to show this and have the conversation with it. I think that's really the advantageous piece of it as well.
Absolutely. Other questions?
Lots of them. Oh, this, you got her? Okay.
This might be a really simplistic question, but if I, as a designer, want to walk out of here after this conference and buy a diamond that I know who mined it and who cut it, and I can sell it to my customer, can I do that today and not have it be from Canada? Or does it have, what can I do it today? That's my very simple question.
The answer to that is on today's day, Saturday. On Thursday, we had a table out with them. And
Yes.
we still have the goods. So, talk
But
to
are
us.
you, not to,
We have all
not to
the
diminish what you're doing, but are you the source? Like if I want to do it today, are you the one and only source for that? And then my follow-up question is, what is making that so difficult? How can we help accelerate bringing root diamonds to market,
Right.
so that can be more widely available, to all?
I think the quick answer to that is we've been sitting on our first load of rough for a while. We produced some of it and polished. We have basically the unpolishable, the smaller pieces that can't be produced effectively in the United States by artisanal miners. We haven't trained these cutters up yet, but we have those and we need to sell them so that we can reinvest and start the model, jump-start it. And this show is the first time we've had them available, and it's kind of an informal level. The background, again, the structure behind it, to be able to go to the website, click on the diamond, see the miner, get that feedback loop, everything that's built into the model has taken, it takes a lot of time to build all that, and Foss, bless his heart, has done an enormous amount of work on that, but he's also a PhD candidate. And he's also working for Meta, and he's also getting married next week, so great question.
So how do we support, I guess?
You can, get a hold of me or Foss or Mickey and just talk to us outside here. And we're still in town and we still have some.
And we have our website, woodstudios.org. You can go and send us a message. It's live, and you can actually see on woodstudios.org the supply chain aspect, which is wood diamonds on there. And then you can reach out to us. So we have a manifestation of that to start surfacing the conversations.
But for today, talk to us.
I think, was it?
Jay and Eric.
Okay.
Just.
Oh, I've got it flipped off. Can you see it? Here.
Push up. So, here we go. Hello?
Nope, this one. Oh, I'm not the only one that struggled with that.
Thank you. Just very quickly, Roy, thanks for showing us, or at least me, being sort of familiar with the Kano district very superficially, and having additional clarity on conditions on the ground for the last few years is fantastic. The question goes back to the ability for the communities, and I understood from the video, from the documentary, that there is a period in which there's agriculture happens, and sometimes by choice, you go out in the fields to do agriculture when the time's right, and then go back to that. Within that informal structure that occurs in the diamond mining, where you have the diggers and the sponsors and brokers, dealers, exporters, etc. My question is the same structure, informal structure, in the agricultural sector? And is that the reason why it happened as it began? Or is it more formalized? And then the same question bounces back to Faz, is if the agricultural formalization, in a way, is going to be part of that future curriculum about keeping the communities doing what they're doing, basically.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and I guess it comes back to what do we mean by formalization, really. So when we're talking about mining, it's about legalizing, it's about making sure that the miner has a license, that everything's been checked out with the Ministry of Mines, and they have the right permits, and if it's small scale mining, you need the environmental impact assessment. So there's this formalized system. With agriculture, most of the agriculture in the provinces is small scale farming that's going on. It varies from chieftain to chieftain, but generally the paramount chief is the custodian of the land and allocates. It's an informal allocation. I mean, people don't buy. It happens in some places, I believe. You can correct me, but generally it's families who have been using the land over generations that have the user right to the land. I think commercial agriculture is a different business altogether. But generally, I think the fact that these two different economies happen at different times of year has been in some ways quite a positive thing. So you'll find also very entrepreneurial farmers who overproduce rice, and then will be able to have a market to sell if they can hang on to it, when people are mining in the dry season. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's also problematic in a way, in that in rural areas everything is happening informally in some ways, all the businesses, and then now we're trying to create this sort of these pockets of formalization to do with mining in this huge, vast landscape of informality. So again, it's about thinking about how these, well-intentioned initiatives and ideas map on locally to what's happening, and is that going to work or not? I think, but it's a really good question. I'll let Faz chip in here, I think.
I think. So I think a lot of, in the agricultural space too, you see a lot of community-centered, sort of like co-ops that actually have enabled some success. I think there's been actually a lot of success, but what the challenge has been in the, is that because of the different sectors and the challenges and the motivations and the level or the proportion of conflicting interest that is in the artisanal expression of mining has actually made that more challenging. So actually people have actually tried to implement the core models of agriculture over, like a spillover, and it has failed because I think, in many sense, it has failed, and I think it's because of the nuances that we have within the diamond space that is actually this sort of, and this is the very interesting thing about this umbrella of capitalism that we have is that it seeks to make everything in its own image, right? So it's transforming that to a very sort of exploitative state that stresses the system. And I think that's why it hasn't worked. And I think in some ways, artisanal mining solutions are going to be small, local, and multiple, right? And very contextual to that space. And that requires a massive amount of infrastructure, technical knowledge that all plays a role. I think in my insight, I think that's some of the challenges why the spillover has not worked.
I think within the sort of informal sphere in agriculture, there's been a lot of positive things that have happened too, like particularly around, the solutions that people come up with are ingenious. So in terms of labor, they'll have these reciprocal labor relationships. In Kano, they call it boma. And so they'll all go to one farm and work on a farm for 2 days and do all of the work, and the farm owner will supply the palm wine and the food. And then the next week they'll be on someone else's farm. And it's a very efficient way of getting labor done in a system where people don't have money and there's, it's very difficult. Likewise with access to finance and credit. There's often not micro credit schemes available, but women will use reciprocal, like revolving credit schemes, like they call it osusu in Kono, where everyone will contribute to a pot and it will go to one person, 1 week, and then. But these kinds of, I think it's not right for us to say that all informal systems are bad and formalization is what we need to do. There are good things within informality that we can build upon, I think.
Useful.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
No, actually, I think we've run out of time for questions. I'm so sorry. Promise you'll all stay. Promise you'll all come to the party, and then you guys can just accost them there, okay? So Brandee, how would you like to wrap up?
Thank you.
Fair enough.